in Fantasyland, there was an interesting idea that Walt Disney had come up with. It was related to the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea movie. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was written by Jules Verne, but the Walt Disney Company created a live-action version of it that came out in the 1950s. It starred James Mason and Kirk Douglas and Peter Lorre, among others, and it was an interesting look at Jules Verne's, an adaptation of Jules Verne's story. And so when the Disney Company was kind of planning up this idea for Walt Disney World, the idea was, why not create something that's related to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? At some point, after the movie came out in the 1950s, Walt Disney put some of the props and other things on display at Disneyland near some of the water attractions he had there, and he found that it was fairly successful. People were interested in it. So why not create a show that's all about the Nautilus and its exciting time going 20,000 leagues under the sea? So they took this enormous part of the park that spans all the way from what is the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train over there to Ariel's Grotto, where she has the Ariel Under the Sea attraction, which goes through there, and was this entire space and a big show building behind it. And it was this idea to take people under the sea and go along and see what it was like going on Jules Verne's voyage. It was really amazing. Unfortunately, there were a lot of problems with the boats and other things that happened, and at some point it closed, and that was the end of that. But then Disney had to figure out how to reuse this space, and that's when they came up with these two attractions to replace them. But let's delve into the history, or maybe dive into the history, and go 20,000 leagues under the sea.
In the mid-1800s, Jules Verne was cranking out novels that set a new standard for a genre called science fiction. He may be considered the father of sci-fi, but his contemporaries in H.G. Wells and Hugo Gernsback were also entertaining audiences in this new space, telling people stories about fantastical times in the future. Now, Verne wrote several well-known tomes, such as From the Earth to the Moon, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and Around the World in 80 Days. But arguably, his best-known work, well, at least in Disney circles, was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, you may already realize that a league is a measure of distance, and the title refers to the distance traveled while under the sea, not a depth below the surface. Now, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea tells us the story of Captain Nemo and his submarine, the Nautilus, as seen from the perspective of Professor Pierre Aronnax. The Cliff Notes version of the story goes something like this. A mysterious sea monster, theorized by some as the giant narwhal, is sighted by ships of several nations. The United States government finally assembles an expedition in New York City to track down and destroy the menace, and Professor Pierre Aronnax, a noted French marine biologist and narrator of the story, who happens to be in New York at the time, and he's recognized as an expert in this field, is issued a last-minute invitation to join the expedition. And he accepts. Canadian master harpoonist Ned Land and Aronnax's faithful assistant Conseil are brought on board. The expedition sets sail from Brooklyn aboard a naval ship, and the monster is found, and the ship charges into battle, and during the fight the ship's steering is damaged, and the three protagonists are thrown overboard. They find themselves stranded on the hide of the creature, only to discover to their surprise that it's a large metal construct. They're quickly captured and brought inside the vessel, where they meet the enigmatic creator and commander of the ship, Captain Nemo. The rest of the story follows the adventures of the protagonists aboard the submarine, which was built in secrecy and now roams the seas free from any land-based government. Captain Nemo's motivations are implied to be both scientific and that thirst for knowledge, and a desire for revenge on and a self-imposed exile from civilization. Captain Nemo explains that the submarine is electrically powered and equipped to carry out a cutting-edge marine biology research. He also tells his new passengers that while he appreciates having an expert such as Aronnax on board, with whom he can converse, they can never leave because he's afraid they will betray his existence to the world. Aronnax is enthralled by the undersea vistas he's seeing, but Land constantly plots to escape. Their travels take them to numerous points around the world's oceans. The travelers witness real corals of the Red Sea, the wrecks of the Battle of Vigo Bay, the Antarctic ice shelves, the fictional submerged Atlantis. They don diving suits and go on undersea expeditions away from the ship, where they hunt sharks and other marine life, and have a funeral for a crew member who died when an accident occurred inside the Nautilus. When the Nautilus returns to the Atlantic Ocean, a pulpa, usually translated as giant squid, but in the French, pulpa means octopus, attacks the vessel and devours a crew member. Now remember that this whole story is taking place in the 1870s, and really none of this was possible, so for Verne to have created such a fantastical world is simply amazing. Now the story suggests that Captain Nemo exiled himself from the world after an encounter with an oppressive country which affected his family. He's depicted as a champion of the world's underdogs and downtrodden, and near the end of the book, the Nautilus is tracked and attacked by a mysterious ship from that nation. Nemo ignores Aronnax's pleas for amnesty, and the boat retaliates. Nemo attacks the ship under the waterline, sending it to the bottom of the ocean with all the crew aboard as Aronnax watches from the saloon. Nemo bows before this picture of his wife and children and is plunged into depression after the encounter, and voluntarily or involuntarily allows the submarine to wander into an encounter with the Måkenströmmen, or Maelstrom, which is a whirlpool off the coast of Norway. This gives the three prisoners an opportunity to escape, and they make it back to land alive, but the fate of Captain Nemo and his crew is not revealed. And how does Disney weigh into this? How do they figure into the whole thing? Well, the answer is that in the late 1930s, every major motion picture studio was looking for the next big innovation in the movies. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had pioneered a new innovation in 1939, and that was color. And not only that, they had done it stunningly, using two well-known novels as the backdrops for this new method of storytelling. The first release was The Wizard of Oz in August of 1939, followed by Gone with the Wind in December of the same year. As a result, every motion picture studio wanted to get in on this business. And so a race of sorts was on to acquire the rights to some of the world's most famous novels. In short order, Disney was able to snap up the rights to several, including 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But then, as you may have guessed, World War II got in the way. Large-scale theatrical productions based on novels were put on the back burner for a period of time, and instead there was a whole genre of films that centered around the war. Certainly there were other films made, but the war-themed films dominated the industry for years to come. But as the war ended, film production came back to broader topics. There was a thirst for new films that explored different worlds and different eras, and so in the early 1950s, Walt Disney gave a go-ahead to the production of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, for the most part, the film was a straight lift from the book. The centerpiece, Nautilus, relied on the descriptions by Verne and pulled heavily from the drawings that were done a few years later. The movie starred Kirk Douglas as Ned Land, James Mason as Captain Nemo, Paul Lucas as Professor Pierre Aronnax, and Peter Lorre as Conseil. It was the first science fiction film that Disney produced in the Walt Disney Productions, as well as the only science fiction film produced by Walt Disney himself. It was also the first feature-length Disney film to be distributed by Buena Vista Distribution, and the film had become the best-known adaptation of the book by the same name, and it was cited as an early example of the genre of steampunk, or science fiction that typically featured steam-powered machinery. And this was Disney's fifth live-action film overall. Now, as far as the differences between the book and the movie, in the movie version, Nemo takes Aronnax to the penal colony of Rurapente. Nemo reveals that he once was a prisoner there himself, as well as many of the crew in the Nautilus. And the prisoners they see are loading munitions onto a ship. It embarks at sunset, whereupon the Nautilus rams it, destroying its munitions, cargo, and killing the entire crew. When confronted by Aronnax, an anguished Nemo said that his actions have just saved thousands from death in war. He also discloses that this hated nation had tortured his wife and son to death in an attempt to force him to reveal the secrets of his work. Meanwhile, Ned discovers the coordinates of Nemo's secret island base, Vulcania, and releases messages in bottles, hoping somebody will find them and free him from captivity. And then at the end of the movie, Nautilus returns to Vulcania, where Nemo finds the island surrounded by warships, presumably because of the actions of land. The ships have deployed Marines who are converging on his hideout. As Nemo goes ashore, Aronnax realizes what's happening and realizes that Nemo will destroy the evidence of all his discoveries. He's right, and Nemo plants a bomb in his hideout, but is mortally wounded from a slug in the back while he's returning to the Nautilus. After haphazardly navigating the submarine away from Vulcania, Nemo announces he will be taking the Nautilus down for the last time. Loyal to Nemo to the very end, his entire crew declared that they will accompany the captain to his death. Aronnax, Conseil, and Ned are taken forcibly to their cabins. The Nautilus's crew is also retreat to their own cabins at Nemo's instructions. Ned breaks loose, overcomes the first mate who's tried to stop him, escapes to the now-deserted bridge, and manages to surface the Nautilus, hitting a reef in the process and causing the ship to begin flooding rapidly. In his final moments, Nemo staggers to the viewing window, collapses, and looks at his beloved ocean one last time as he dies. Aronnax tries to go back to retrieve his journal, which contains detailed accounts of the voyage, but the urgency of their escape obliges Ned to knock him unconscious and carry him out. The companions witness Vulcania destroyed in an explosion. Aronnax's diary of the voyage is also lost forever, and when Ned apologizes for having hit him, the professor replies, "Perhaps you did mankind a service, Ned." The shock of the explosion causes the Nautilus to sink even more quickly as it disappears beneath the waves forever. Nemo's last words to Aronnax echo, "And when the world is ready for a new and better life, all this will someday come to pass in God's good time." Now, as far as production of the movie goes, filming began in the spring of 1954, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was filmed at various locations in the Bahamas and Jamaica primarily, with cave scenes filmed beneath what is now the Shadabi Resort in the Cliffs of Negril. Some location filming sequences were so complex that they required a technical crew of over 400 people to be involved in it. The film presented many other challenges as well. The infamous giant squid attack scene had to be entirely reshot, as it was originally filmed as taking place at dusk in a calm sea. It was then filmed again taking place at night and during a huge gale, both to increase the drama and to better hide the cables and other mechanical workings of the animatronic squid. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea received positive reviews from critics and was the second highest grossing film of the year behind White Christmas, earning about $8 million in ticket sales in North America. And it's become a notable classic film of the Disney Corporation. Audiences fondly remember it primarily for its giant squid battle sequence as well as the Nautilus itself and James Mason's portrayal of Nemo. The film still holds about a 91% approval rating according to Rotten Tomatoes. One of Disney's finest live-action adventures, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea brings Jules Verne's classic sci-fi tale to vivid life and features an awesome giant squid. The film was also highly praised for its performances of its leading actors. This was the first time that a major international film stars such as Kirk Douglas, James Mason, and Peter Lorre had appeared in a Disney film. It was nominated for several Academy Awards and won two. It won for Best Art Direction and Color from John Meehan and Emil Curry. And it also won for Best Special Effects from John Hench and Joshua Meador. The movie production included a song that was sung by Kirk Douglas, and yes, it was actually sung by Kirk Douglas and not lip-synced as I originally thought it was. Kirk Douglas was quoted as saying, "It was a really rollicking song that everyone liked. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea holds a very special place in my heart because it was the movie that made me a star to young kids. In my earlier movies, I had played a rather rough characters that kids probably shouldn't have seen. But when I played Ned Land in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, all of a sudden, I had a whole new audience." And that's the story of the movie. Now, as Disney fans know, the story doesn't quite end there. Since the movie came out in 1954 and Disneyland opened in 1955, Walt Disney actually had the sets moved to Disneyland. So many of the original sets became a walk-through attraction that was open from 1955 until 1966, so guests could go in and experience what life aboard the Nautilus might have been all about. And then in 1959, an ambitious expansion of Tomorrowland and Disneyland was completed, which included the addition of a new attraction including the Matterhorn bobsleds, the monorail, and the Submarine voyage. Now, the Submarine voyage was commissioned on June 6, 1959 in front of Richard Nixon, Walt Disney and his wife Lillian, and officers of the U.S. Navy. Now, the attraction made use of early animatronics to create underwater life and used the forced perspective method to increase the feeling of realism. 8 submarines were painted in Cold War-friendly gray that took guests through the attraction, which took place in the lagoon visible from Tomorrowland, and a large show building hidden behind 2 waterfalls. It became extremely popular with guests, and Walt Disney Imagineering consequently planned a more elaborate version for the forthcoming Florida project, which would become Walt Disney World. So the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea attraction at Walt Disney World was affectionately called 20K. The ride at Walt Disney World opened on October 14, 1971, that's 2 weeks after the park opened, and is considered one of the original flagship attractions. It took up about 25% of the real estate in Fantasyland, and that's really astounding if you stop and think about it, and remember that it's only about a third of the size that they originally planned the ride to be. Now, the 20K attraction and the Submarine voyage shared many of the same elements in animatronics. And that could be how we wound up with out-of-place mermaids and a kind of silly-looking sea serpent in the 20K attraction, since they weren't part of the original story. But even so, it's obvious how 20K was tweaked and improved in almost every respect. In the Disney World version, the huge water tank held about 11.5 million gallons of water. And this was the biggest and most expensive of Disney's attractions that had ever been conceived. There's a story that the Magic Kingdom attraction was originally intended to have been installed in place of the Submarine voyage in California in 1959, as the two attractions were identical for the most part except for the theming and a couple of elements of the plot. It's also believed that the ride's corporate sponsor, General Dynamics, preferred to keep the original concept, so the Submarine voyage opened in 1959 with a non-specific theme and with nuclear as opposed to Victorian submarines. Now, despite the efforts of construction and installation teams attached to the 20,000 Leagues project, the attraction opened 2 weeks after the Magic Kingdom due to infrastructure problems with the lagoon.
So what you'll see here is this is where the loading area was for 20,000 Leagues, and the area over there that's the aerial under the sea, that actually used to be the ride and show building where you would go in the submarine and you would be under the sea because it could make it dark and feel like you were under the sea. So this area has a special history and it's kind of interesting, and there's a little more to the story. Now there are a couple of hidden tributes to the 20K ride over by Ariel's Grotto, but let's talk a little bit about some of the history of some of these.
The completed attraction covered almost a quarter of Fantasyland, including the lagoon and the hidden show building that's surrounded by palm trees and volcanic rock, meant to evoke the impression of Captain Nemo's Pacific Ocean base in Volcania. A storage facility at the back of the show building served to house submarines removed from the main line during day-to-day operation, and also included a dry dock for repair work. The words 20,000 Leagues were spelled out in nautical code from the signal flags at the entrance of the attraction. The team of cast members operating the attraction played the roles of Nemo's ever-silent crew, and even wore authentic replicas of the Screen Productions costumes. Along the shores of the lagoon, small beaches were built, one with a chest of abandoned pirate treasure. Now, the signature pieces of the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea were the 12 vehicles adapted for theme park use from Harper Goff's Nautilus designs from the 1954 live-action version by Disney Imagineer George McGinnis. And while 12 isn't quite correct in terms of the number of submarines, there were actually two more. Each had a Roman numeral 13 on its side, maybe it was an unlucky number, which grappled with the giant squids on either side of the track that the submarine rode along. The vehicles weighed some 40 tons and were installed into a concrete guide track mounted on top of a mechanism that limited bumping accidents. The attraction vehicles were not actually submarines, but instead boats in which guests sat below the water level. But on the surface, they looked just like the Nautilus that appeared in the movies, green, sleek, and beautiful. The interiors were a mix of metal paneling, rivets, and bolts, as well as Victorian-esque fittings in the form of passenger seats that could flip outwards. The armrests beneath the portholes in keeping with the Harper Goff concepts from the 1954 film. Each guest aboard the Nautilus has his or her own seat, as well as round portholes to look out the attraction. Located at the top of the window was a recess with a small speaker through which Captain Nemo guides his guests through their underwater adventure. Above the seating area was the sail, as it was known in nautical terms and certainly known to all the cast members, where the helmsman stood and controlled the vehicle's operation. The diving effect was produced by bubble machines located throughout the attraction, as well as using waterfalls to hide the entrance to the show building. Now, each of the 12 vehicles accommodated a total of 40 riders. Now, voice artist Pete Renaday stood in for James Mason in the role of Captain Nemo. The Walt Disney Imagineering team that worked at a facility in Glendale, California, began the expansion in the late 1960s to handle all of the new attractions planned for the upcoming Walt Disney World. Now, Disney had contracts with a number of companies in the U.S. To build ride vehicles. Tampa Shipyard in Florida rebuilt existing steam engines for the Walt Disney World Railroad and had been contracted for the final assembly of the 20K submarines, as well as a lot of the Walt Disney World watercraft. Now, George McGinnis styled his Walt Disney World 20K subs after the Jules Verne sub in the movie of the same name. Now, Morgan Yacht in Clearwater, Florida, started building the basic hulls. So essentially what you were doing was taking some drawings that George McGinnis had come up with, and now you had some drafters pumping out wiring diagrams and supplying equipment that was arriving daily at the submarine shop. The people that worked in the Tampa shipyard had to put all this together. In the meantime, the fancy interior trim parts began to arrive. So Morgan Yacht was over making the interior parts, and they were a little loose with the dimensions, perhaps. And George McGinnis was trying to fit everything back up in the studio in Burbank. But here were these guys in the Tampa shipyard trying to fit everything together, no matter what didn't fit right. They finally came up with their first sub on August 13th, 1971. Now they had to get a special flatbed to be able to put a 40-ton sub on to be able to take it over to Walt Disney World. And it took a whole day to make the drive there with this spectacular Jules Verne creation weaving its way through small towns, trying to find a route to miss all the overhead power lines and such. Now, 20K was originally set up as an e-ticket attraction, and it was a smashing success. Now, one little story for you is the crews of 20K and the Jungle Cruise often competed for which attraction could dazzle more visitors in a day, and 20K seems to have always won, according to legend. Now, the ride wasn't for everyone, but the young and imaginative loved it. It's not about thrill rides, it's about storytelling. It's about making something that was really unique and different. It didn't matter where you sat in the sub, the images were shown on both sides of the sub, so no matter where you sat, you saw everything he describes.
Secure ship for sea. Make all preparations for getting underway.
Aye, aye, sir. All hands at station. Single up all lines. Cast off board. Cast off aft. Secure hatches and vents.
This is Captain Nemo speaking. Welcome aboard the Nautilus. We are proceeding on a course that will take us on a voyage 20,000 leagues under the sea. I believe we've made a startling discovery. These classic ruins could very well be the legendary lost continent of Atlantis. Some scholars theorize that a remarkable civilization was destroyed by a tremendous volcano. Treat any concept of Atlantis as pure fantasy, along with legends of sea serpents and mermaids.
Begging your pardon, sir, but did you say sea serpents are mere fantasies?
Belay there, mate. Anyone in his right mind knows there's no such thing as a sea serpent or mermaids. Mr. Baxter, if you think you're seeing mermaids and sea monsters, you've been submerged too long. Good Lord! It's one of ours. Its hull has been crushed like an eggshell.
Another monster is attacking forward, sir.
Full repellent charge.
Repellent charge, aye, aye. Maximum voltage.
Emergency maneuver. All engines. Stand by to surface.
Aye, aye.
Surface.
Surface. Surface. Surface. Brace all changes, sir.
Proceed on course. All ahead.
All ahead, aye, aye.
Station the maneuvering watch.
Aye, aye, sir. All hands.
That's pretty cool. Now, the 20K ride was abruptly, temporarily closed for renovations on September 5th, 1994, which is, as it turned out, was a nice way of saying, we're shutting down a great ride forever. Apparently, Disney was seeking a corporate sponsor for the 20K ride to raise money for its rehabilitation, as in brought to you by Brand X Toilet Bowl Cleaner, which clearly didn't come to pass. And it wasn't until early 1996 that they actually admitted that the 20K ride was closed forever. There are many rumors as to why the 20K ride closed. Some say it was because of a very high maintenance cost, others because it was difficult for handicapped people to access, and yet others because of the spotty air conditioning sometimes let it get too hot inside and people would faint. Of course, it was a fear of the giant squid that sent those people down, not the heat. Now, Jim Hill from Jim Hill Media has what I think is the real story behind the 20K ride shutdown, and as you're about to find out, the conspiracy ran far deeper than anyone might have imagined. So he says, if I had to pick the most extreme example of Walt Disney World staffers deliberately faking out folks back in Burbank, I'd have to say that it was 20,000 leagues under the Ovitz Sea. Or as this incident is better known in Walt Disney World inner circles, the time we slipped Mike Ovitz a Mickey. When Disney's CEO, Michael Eisner, put out the word in the summer of 1994 that the theme parks really had to start towing the line cost-wise, Walt Disney World ops staff finally saw their chance. By shutting down this single Fantasyland attraction, they could automatically save the company beaucoup bucks, as well as shine in Team Disney Burbank's eyes for moving so quickly to honor Eisner's wishes, not to mention putting an end to their enormous annual maintenance headache forever. What these Walt Disney World ops guys hadn't counted on was that the public would get so upset when they found out that 20K had quickly and quietly been closed back in September 1994. when then-president and Walt Disney Company Michael Ovitz came through the Walt Disney World Resort on a corporate familiarization trip. Of course, while Ovitz was touring the Magic Kingdom, he brought up all the guest complaints about 20K being closed. In response to this, the ops staff insisted that they had only shut down the Fantasyland attraction because the ride was in such awful shape, not to mention being unsafe. Ovitz said, "Well, I'd like to personally take a look at the attraction, judge for myself on whether or not the ride can be repaired and reopened." The following morning at 7 a.m., Mike Ovitz found himself standing at the queue of the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as a sub that was loudly belching smoke came rumbling up to the dock. The Disney Company president then climbed down the stairs and found a quarter-inch of water sloshing around the bottom of the boat. When Mike pointed this out, the Walt Disney World ops staff said, "Well, you have to understand a lot of our subs are over 20 years old, Mr. Ovitz." Now, as you might imagine, once the boat pulled up to the dock, Michael quickly climbed out of the mildewed interior. He then turned to Disney World's operations staff and told them that they had made the right decision. That given the shape 20K was currently in, the safest and smartest thing to do with this Fantasyland attraction was to keep it closed, permanently. Now, I don't have to tell you smart people that Walt Disney World's operations staff had sandbagged Ovitz. They had deliberately picked out the 20K sub that was in the worst possible mechanical shape for him to ride in. They recruited a ride operator that they could trust to give Michael Ovitz the roughest ride imaginable. They had even thrown a few buckets of water down to the bottom of the boat to simulate a pinhole leak, all in an effort to leave Ovitz with the impression that Walt Disney World subs were beyond salvaging. Now here's the rest of the story according to a former cast member named Bass. The subs used to have water sloshing around inside, but that was when the waterfalls at the entrance to the exit caverns poured over the upper decks of each sub. So Fantasyland management dammed the waterfalls so the water fell to both sides of the sub, not directly on them. In order for the 20K sub boats to operate, they had to adhere to Florida laws in regards to watercraft. The hulls of these boats didn't leak. If they got water inside, it was rare and because of rain coming through the hatches or something else. Another point was that Fantasyland management did not rehab 20K annually. So all the water in Walt Disney World is derived from the Florida aquifer, not city water. It was the same water that was used to fill 20K. They had to chlorinate the heck out of it to keep it clean and clear, and it was the chlorine and what other chemicals that ate the paint off of everything in the 20K lagoon, including the boats. To their credit, the maintenance folks looked like they were always short-handed and had to wear many hats, had low maintenance budgets, and had to fix things with gum and baling wire, figuratively speaking, so if maintenance was lacking, it was that Fantasyland management shorted 20K maintenance budgets, which is why they were rehabbed only 2 or 3 times in the 20-plus years. If they had maintained them on a regular basis, it wouldn't have been so expensive to fix. Now, don't believe everything you read. Wheelchair-bound guests were not a factor in shutting down 20K. Many disabled people rode that ride, and the Americans with Disability Acts protects rides like 20K that were grandfathered in and allowed to continue to operate, even though they weren't truly wheelchair accessible. For a while after the shutdown, the subs were hanging around in the lagoon, but eventually they were removed to a backlot scrapyard. Disney auctioned off numerous portholes from the subs and sold them on eBay. Years later, 8 of the subs were auctioned off to a scrap dealer. One of the subs is reported to have been buried on Disney property as part of a ritual they observed when a ride is retired. More exciting was that possibly 2 or 3 of the subs were sent down to Disney's Caribbean resort island, Castaway Cay, which is where all the Disney cruises ended up. One of them was completely submerged and you could scuba dive near it. But subsequent to that, there have been reports that the subs have gone missing and are presumed to have been removed by Disney, destroyed by a hurricane, or simply crumbled away. After that, there was a lot of speculation about what the space would be used for. Now, based on guest surveys, Imagineering knew that Walt Disney World guests thought that the Magic Kingdom was long overdue for a new thrill ride. Now, as I understand it, everyone in Imagineering agreed that the 20K site offered some tremendous opportunities, but no one could agree on what sort of attraction should be built in that spot. So, according to legend, what happened was there were 2 schools of thought that Imagineering divided up into. Those who thought that any attraction that was proposed to replace 20K had to be a Jules Verne-like attraction, and those who thought that any new thrill ride that was planned for this part of the Magic Kingdom had to be a good neighbor to Fantasyland and to Mickey's Toontown Fair, and that this attraction should be kid-friendly and fantasy-based, and perhaps maybe cartoony in nature. Now, the Jules Verne group came up with a number of ideas, and not surprisingly, a couple of them revolved around 20K. There was a theme motion-based simulator and a Nautilus walkthrough proposed by the group. Still, this group of Imagineers wanted to come up with a ride concept that was bold, new, and exciting and would grab the Walt Disney World management's attention, but still have that old Jules Verne feel. they actually considered making a new thrill ride that could logically be housed inside a mountain. Guests had told them they wanted a new thrill ride in the Magic Kingdom, but not necessarily a roller coaster. In answer to the question, guests' favorite new ride at Walt Disney World was the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror over at the MGM Studios. So using this as a basis for the idea, the Imagineers hit on what they thought was the it. Their attraction would start off as a standard running-on-rails roller coaster. Midway through, the ride system would suddenly transform, changing to a hang-from-above coaster, and what might cause the change? Well, the erupting volcano. They batted around ideas for names and finally settled on Fire Mountain to capture the essence of the volcano exploding. Now, did I mention there was another team working on a design? They too started out with guest surveys. They focused on a guest favorite being Splash Mountain in Frontierland. And they also noticed that guests complained about an hour-long wait to ride that attraction. A flume attraction was the obvious choice for this group of Imagineers, but their approach had to do something cartoony was a little bit problematic, and that's when they talked with people in consumer products who saw a new demand for Disney villains. It took some time, but they decided on building a sort of flume ride based around all of the Disney villains. Of course, it should be called Villain Mountain. The Imagineers on this team didn't stop there, though. They had reportedly dozens of ideas for the attraction. So many ideas that they had to change from a Villain Mountain single ride to a concept that was a whole new land at the Magic Kingdom. When they were ready, each group made a presentation to Walt Disney World management. And fortunately, or unfortunately for both, management couldn't decide. Each of those proposed ride concepts was so distinct and so strong that the management was dazzled by them. And that's all fine and good, except that it never happened. The plans took an unexpected detour. 9/11 happened. Park attendance dropped sharply and all new projects were put on hold. Now, the recession that followed went on for the better part of 8 years. And when Disney decided to consider the two mountains, the Fire Mountain project was shelved somewhat permanently, well, at least for now, and the guests' interest in villains was kind of fading. Plus, Disney executives were trying to get out of the Toontown business. They wanted to kind of move on from Mickey's Toontown Fair. And that would free up the 20K area to be less cartoony. And that began the genesis for the newest desire among guests, more princess interaction. But not to worry, the Dwarves Mine Train still captured a piece of the mountain and concept that each of the two original ideas had set forth. So the new Fantasyland was now the talk of the day, and it opened in the space that was occupied by both 20K and Toontown. Now, closing the proverbial loop. In 1994, a walk-through attraction at Disneyland Paris, The Mystery of the Nautilus, opened. And that's a fitting place, since Jules Verne was French, after all. And the idea of Fire Mountain resurfaced to a degree in Japan. A reimagining of Volcania led to the mysterious island at Tokyo Disney Sea. There, the Journey to the Center of the Earth ride concludes with an explosion out of a volcano.